I forgot to set the timer for the extra 5 minutes. I saw a note over here from Nancy Cohen. It said, "Nothing is happening." Zen is very big on nothing, Nancy. Really big on emptiness, but maybe you weren't here last week. Thanks everybody for showing up, and thanks, not one heart fart went across the screen during meditation. I was really pleased by that. Thanks so much. So the advertisement was to talk today about enlightenment. It's a lot to talk about. When I first read about Zen Buddhism when I was about 14 years old, I read a book called The Three Pillars of Zen. And Satori or Kensho, seeing into one's own nature, enlightenment, was described in a kind of romanticized way that was perfect for a fat, awkward 14-year-old who didn't speak coherently around girls he was attracted to. And so I had this image that enlightenment was going to be the solution to every problem that I ever had, and that it would give me superhuman powers and wisdom. And I began on a course of stultifying reading and quoting Zen aphorisms to my friends, just putting them to sleep with cryptic, mystical-sounding utterances, you know. What's the sound of one hand clapping, Freddie? Well, traces of that kind of continue. And I think a lot of people are attracted to practice on this promise of enlightenment, even though Suzuki Roshi did not talk about it too often. Yes, it's something that happens or may happen. It doesn't seem critical to Buddhist practice. One of my teachers, Robert Aitken, a completely upright man whose wife was his student for 50 years, I don't think had a Kensho experience, but he was a great teacher. Very helpful to me, and widely respected. Wrote a good book called Taking the Path of Zen, which is a real how-to book. Anyway, the allure of enlightenment can be something of a problem, because if you sit down on your pillow with an idea that you're over here, is my hand on screen? Yeah. You're over here, some messed up ball of wax that needs to be improved, and enlightenment is over here, you're never going to get the two together, because there are two ideas colliding around in your brain. You know, it's just like gerbils running around inside your skull. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what enlightenment is and what it isn't, and try to relate it to the Eightfold Path that we talked about last week. So it is true that in periods of intense meditation, you can whittle your attention down to such a fine point that your ego can surrender. It's not a permanent surrender. So that's really important to understand. A lot of Zen groups have gotten in trouble by assuming that the teacher is enlightened and nobody else is, and thinking of enlightenment as a fence that you climb over, and once you're on the other side of it, you're home free. You can drive 14 Rolls Royces. You can do whatever you want because you're enlightenment and you're not attached to all that crazy stuff that the rest of us are. But it's not like that. And so even if you have a Kensho experience or several, maybe it's going to be 10 to 30 minutes out of your life where everything's going to be the same but different, because you're going to be gone temporarily. And in that space, you can actually perceive the interdependence of things, how everything is just like a soap bubble. It's not always a pleasant experience. Someone asked Suzuki Roshi about enlightenment, and he said, you might not like it. When I had my first Kensho experience, I said, oh my God, what am I going to do now? Because I realized that the entire edifice of Buddhism that I had pursued for 40 years was empty, was a soap bubble. That there was absolutely nothing to depend on. Nothing I could grab in this world. It was shocking. And you can't stay in that space. I think I talked last week about the default mode network. If not, I'll review it. The default mode network is the part of our brain that keeps us from being high all the time. It keeps us in the known world of named separate objects. And it has an obvious survival benefit. If we were all, our proto-hominids were running around goosed on acid, completely mesmerized by every little butterfly or twinkle of dew on a blade of grass, we'd have been saber-toothed tiger food. But the default mode network is not an absolute dictator. And in fact, when we meditate or when we take psychedelics, it relaxes and disappears and allows mental connections to be made that are normally kind of held at bay. So enlightenment is kind of like that, or a Kensho awakening is kind of like that. And the reason that most teachers say it's not so important or don't dwell on it so much is because if you're not a kind person, if you're not a compassionate person, who cares what kind of spiritual experience you have? What do I care that Buddha came down and gave you 8,000 roses, kissed your feet and blew your nose? If you're not a nice person, it's meaningless. And if you don't have a full understanding of the interrelationship of the Eightfold Path, and you're practicing right livelihood and awareness and effort and all of those things, you'll be living a pretty good karma-free life. And enlightenment per se may be an afterthought. And when you come back from that experience, that ego that you've had for 30 or 40 or 50 years is still there. Maybe a little shaken. You may see it as less of a solid artifact, as less of a graspable thing than you had before. But you've still got the same problems that you've had. But they're in a larger field. So, for instance, when you see a part of the moon behind clouds, and you just see a little edge of the moon tipping out, you have a really full sense of the roundness of the moon behind the clouds, but you only see the little edge. Well, what enlightenment is seeing the full moon in the little particular. We just see an edge. We see a leaf, we hear a bird cry, we hear a plunk of a stone in a river. We hear something knocking against the wall. And Suzuki Roshi used to call those things letters from emptiness. They remind us of the great, vast emptiness from which all material forms are generated. So, for instance, in my case, I used to feel I had a really tough time with my dad when I was growing up. A violent, dangerous guy. To me, he was quite a wonderful man, actually. I couldn't see that at the time. He wasn't a great dad, but he was a great man. And for years, I felt like I was trapped in a closet with him. And decisions I made and ideas I had about myself were all filtered through what he would think or how he looked at me. I thought my name was shit for brains until I was about 16 years old. But now, I still have trouble sometimes with memories about my dad. But now it's more like we're both independently exploring Yosemite. and we don't see each other for months. And when we do bump into each other, I can handle it. It's not so bad. And given those grace periods, I'm actually able to remember some of the wonderful things he did and some of the miraculous things and some of the great generosity he had for me. So what happens is that your personal problems assume the same kind of unreality as everything else. Remember, I talked about dependent origination. If this exists, then that exists. And the reason that Buddhists say that all things are empty of a self is because everything is made of everything else. It looks like I'm sitting over here, I'm in here, and the rest of it is out there. And that's true as far as it goes. But this is worth repeating. It's also true that we're all connected through oxygen, through sunlight, through water, through microbes in the soil, through the trees producing oxygen, through birds controlling pests, through pollinating insects. So it's equally true that we're all part of one larger thing. And wisdom is remembering both and oscillating back and forth between them, because each one has a shadow. An egocentric point of view leaves out the vast objective networks and systems that we're all connected to, and it reduces the entire world to what we want. But the larger view has problems too. In the larger universal view, it's very easy to overlook the value of an individual or an individual animal or a species, because in the large picture, and then the mind goes directly to things like Stalin and Mao Zedong with these grand plans where 40 and 50 million people starve to death. So each is the antidote to the other. So when you get fixated on the egocentric, on the singular, that's when you want to go look at the problem from the point of view of the holistic. What's it look like from the big picture? So I want to relate that to something that happened yesterday. So yesterday, a young African-American man named George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And his death was videotaped. A policeman kneeled on his throat for 7 minutes in broad daylight, while a nurse was screaming at him to stop to check the man's pulse. And the man died. And the police officers, uncharacteristically, were immediately fired. I don't want to dive too much into statistics because they're always contestable. But the National Academy of Sciences did a study, and that adjusted for population, black men are 2.5 times more likely to die at the hands of police than white men. African American women, 1.4 times more likely. 1 in 1,000 black men die at the hands of the police, and 39 out of 100,000 white men die at the hands of the police. These figures are complicated by the fact that many, many more attacks on the police take place. And it's also true that iatrogenic deaths, like deaths from doctors and nurses and from prescription medicine and mistakes in hospital, vastly outnumber the deaths at the hands of the police. Last year, 1,004 people died at the hands of the police. But this was particularly compelling because this was an execution in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, being videotaped, while the person was being warned by a nurse that they were killing this man. And previously, there was videotape released this morning of the man handcuffed sitting down along the side of a building, talking to a police officer. So the man was under control. So we've all, from Ferguson onward, we've seen this, and this has created the Black Lives Matter, and it's created a countervailing force, White Lives Matter. And it's true that many more white people are killed by police than black people, but not adjusted relatively. So what I want to talk about, I want to relate this notion of enlightenment, which I call seeing the unseen, seeing the interconnections, seeing the dependencies. And people are made uncomfortable by politics. But politics is just the relations between us and the dynamics. Some of them are corrupt, some of them aren't, but we're social beings. And any time there are relationships between us, there are adjustments for power and ego and all sorts of stuff. But what I'm interested in is, what is our responsibility as ethical beings, as spiritual beings, when we live in a culture where part of our citizens, who are guaranteed the same rights and the same privileges as the rest of us, are being killed 2.5 times more frequently than we are. And what do we do or say? Like, there was great moment made that these police officers were fired immediately. And I thought, a murder is committed in broad daylight and the punishment is firing. Doesn't seem important enough, does it? And then I thought, well, why isn't the police chief fired? Why isn't the man who trained the officers and set the policies? And I thought, why isn't the mayor fired? So this is what I came up with in my thinking. This is what is concerning me this morning as a Buddhist, as a person who tries to kind of pursue a life that doesn't cause unnecessary harm. The police are employees. So we know that if their bosses, the mayors, the boards of supervisors, the county supervisors, if they said to them, you cannot continue to kill young African American men, period. We will prosecute you. We'll send you to jail if these are bad killings. If those orders were given, it would stop. Since it hasn't stopped, I have to assume that the orders haven't been given. So then I want to know, why haven't the orders been given? And the most logical reason I can think of is that there's a large, silent population of white people who are afraid of black people. And the ones I've met who are afraid because they know about the 250 years of injustice and Jim Crow laws and repression. And they imagine that each and every black male is as homicidally angry as they feel that they would be. And so the silence, the order not being given to stop, appears to me to be a dog whistle. And the dog whistle is saying to that silent majority who can't express their fear and can't talk about it, we're not going to let them get you. And the police are here to show you that you're safe. We're going to kill 2.5 times more black people just to show you that you're safe. We got it. We have guns, we got helmets, we got everything. I could be wrong in that analysis. But most white people define racism as an individual being cruel or mean or even impolite to a person of a different race or color. But that's such a convenient definition because it completely hides systems from which we profit. We profit from unequal mortgages. Mortgages for Black and Latino people are much more difficult to get. They're much higher interest. The scandal of 2008 demonstrated that pretty clearly. We benefit from the fact that we never have to worry if it's okay for us to be in a store. We don't have to smile or laugh or put white people at ease. We don't have to keep our hands in our pockets to show that we're not stealing anything. We don't have to be afraid for our lives when we're pulled over in a traffic stop. We benefit from better health care. We live longer. So we benefit tangibly from a system that penalizes a substantial portion of our neighbors and friends. I don't know if you have Black friends, but it doesn't matter. We're taking advantage. We're given advantages because we look. I have blue eyes. I have white skin. I'm only half Caucasian. But I benefit from white privilege. And so do all of us. So the question is, what do we do? Do we wait until people are pushed to the point where they burn down their own city? And then everybody goes, cluck, 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 how terrible. I've seen that happen in my lifetime several times. National Guard in the streets of Los Angeles, Detroit. So the question is, what's the job of police? We call them law enforcement. Well, think about enforcement. Most people obey the law because the laws are reasonable. Law is an agreement. A stop sign, it's an agreement. We're going to stop because it's safer to stop. So we could think of policemen and we could train policemen to be peace officers, and we could say that that's their first priority, is to ensure the peace. And we could insist that verbal de-escalation be the first place they turn to unless they're under physical attack. But I'm not a policeman. I don't train the policeman, but I'm a citizen that the policemen are supposed to protect, and I'm part of the salary of the policeman with the taxes that I pay. And so I don't exactly have a solution, but I know that unless we become conscious, unless we look at this edge of the moon coming out from the clouds and remember the full body of the moon behind the clouds, which includes the murder of unarmed Black men and women, we're not seeing things as they are. We're not seeing clearly. And to see clearly may not always be pleasant. But you can't pour a quart into a pint pitcher. And the quart is reality, and the pint is our ideas about reality. So right now, we're going to have an election in November. And no matter who wins, there are going to be millions and millions of disaffected people, angry and unhappy. That's not a recipe for a prosperous or a virtuous or a peaceful nation. And that scenario is being writ small with the death of Black men on the city streets, unarmed Black men, murdered in handcuffs, shot running away in the back. So it seems to me that if we want to live in a peaceful nation, we have to engage with our own political system. We don't have to engage violently. We don't have to engage angrily. We used to sit and meditate outside of nuclear power plants. But you do have to make yourself heard. You do have to take a stand, because if you don't, I should say, if we don't, we continue to benefit and take advantage of a system which is hurting our friends and neighbors. Really hurting them, killing them. So this is something I'm not going to solve. You're not going to solve. But somehow, in the coming election debates and dialogues, I get 60 emails a day from the Democrats asking for money. I practically busted my allowance this month giving money to Democrats. In a political system that runs by money, people without money are going to be the victims. That's going to be black people, Hispanic people, immigrants. So one of the things that interests me is, in all the discussion about politics and the horse race which goes on in the media, there's kind of a taboo to talk about full federal funding of elections. In Texas, they say you dance with them what brung you. Well, the truth is that our elections are paid for in the majority by the 0.1% that fund both parties. This is part of the shadow of the moon that we don't see. My beloved Obama raised more small donations than any candidate in history, but he only paid for 40% of his campaign. The other 60% was supplied by the 0.1%, which goes a long way toward explaining why not a single person from Wall Street or the hedge funds or derivatives went to jail in 2008 after billions and billions of dollars of fraudulent mortgages, 6 million people a month evicted from their homes, their stuff put out on the street, because they had put Obama in office. And so as citizens, we've become increasingly disenfranchised. When the Supreme Court equates the giving of money with free speech, and then when the Citizens United decision says any amount of money is permissible, you and I are demoted. So if we were going to be strict, we'd say, well, I guess we don't live in a democracy, we live in a corporatocracy. And I mention this because as long as our legislators work for other people, they're not going to listen to our demands about global warming, nuclear threats, crime, violence, whatever, because their first job is to pay back their donors when they get into Washington. It's been reported that they spend between 5 and 6 hours a day raising money. 5 and 6 hours a day. That means more than half the time is not going to the people's business. And when you try to call your legislator, you're one voice among many, but when a donor of $100,000 or $500,000 calls, they're listened to. So I get to this, I'm going to leave this alone now, but I get to this by believing that unless we change the way our elections are paid for, we're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. That until we pay for the legislatures, that each candidate gets the same amount of money, donations are illegal, it's illegal for lobbyists to give money, it's illegal to take a job from a corporation you've supervised for 5 years after you get out of office. We're never going to attract people in office who really want to serve. Not that they're all bad or they're all corrupt, but a system like this forces everybody to make draconian choices. Barbara Boxer's a woman I admire. When she voted $1.5 billion to fund the F-22 fighter jet, which the Army didn't want and the Pentagon didn't want, she did it because the stockholders of the company that built it wanted it, and they were her donors. And I don't think she's a crook at all, but I think she had a really tough choice to make. I think she said, do I turn down this, do I vote against this and lose my seat here, and then lose my struggle on behalf of women, on behalf of civil rights, on behalf of the environment? Or do I let this go as a bonus to these stockholders? So I consider Barbara one of the best. But when she's forced to make a adjustment like this, I know it's happening to everybody. Now, some people can do it without blinking. But why would we throw healthy goldfish into polluted water? Why would we create a system where people go to Washington and they're indentured from the moment they get there? So this is something we could do something about. Because right now my fear is that we can't do much about the police. Police are not paying attention to people shouting in the streets any more than Donald Trump is. Waving signs. That's not doing very much. And certainly our legislators are not doing very much. They certainly didn't prepare us for this pandemic, even though people knew it was coming. So everybody's preoccupied, and I suggest they're preoccupied by the quest for money. And the quest for money is filtering down into our streets, and the evidence that people without money are meaningless is being writ large in the bodies of dead people. So this kind of way of looking at things is not fun, doesn't feel good. I'm sorry for any of you who came here wanted to, walk away with a feel-good moment. But this is the world we live in, and if we're not seriously figuring out how we can engage with it in a nonviolent, persistent, consistent manner, and how we can amplify our own power, and how we can demand that our voices be heard, we have to create a system without money, or that diminishes the value of money. The TV stations are not going to like that. The anchors are not going to like that. The people with money are not going to like that because they're used to buying political influence. That's what wealth gets you. But it doesn't run a culture. And it doesn't make the streets safe. And if you were a black mother and you had 2 sons, if you just reviewed the papers, you'd be scared to death. And what does that mean for me to be comfortable in a culture where my black neighbors are scared to death, or my Latino neighbors are afraid of one fender bender and they'll be exported because they've been working here for 25 years, paying taxes, doing everything, but they don't have citizenship? So what does it mean for me to be comfortable and not to have to worry and just pursue my own spiritual development and be calm and gentle and generous while all this anxiety and injustice is coursing through my country? So I just wanted to share that, and I wanted to pose those questions for each of us to solve in their own way. I'm not the political guru, but I'm laying out the problem in a way in which I don't often see it written about. And enlightenment enforces those connections between all of us. It's not just some of us are spiritual and some of us are not. We're all attached. So my fate depends on all those people. It's like all those prep schoolers who run, State Department and all of this, and these people who send their kids to the best schools, and those kids become the CEOs, and their employees are uneducated. Who's going to buy their products? We're all in it together. So I'm sure everyone's been as horrified as I have been by watching the total lack of preparation for dealing with this pandemic, watching nurses and doctors weeping on television, unprotected, dying in some places of COVID-19 in the richest country on earth. Why we don't have the power to stop that? The analysis is because we don't have the money. And the system is run by money. Is that the country we want to live in? Myself, I find it too painful to be afforded privileges by people who would kill my black neighbors, to be afforded privileges by people who would terrify my Latino and Mexican neighbors, put their children in cages. I can't do that well. So I'm preoccupied with trying to say, what is my responsibility? Just as a good person. I'd like to think of myself as a good person. There are plenty of people who know me well who'll tell you that the verdict's not in. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. But still, at my age now, I'm trying, and I'm trying to build a world that my granddaughter will be safe in and healthy in. When my granddaughter's 40, there'll be 35% less oxygen in the world. It'll be like living at 12,000 feet. Why is that? It's because the political system's controlled by money and controlled by the products we buy and our own difficulties in giving up indulgences. So, as Dylan said, the hour is getting late. Let us not talk falsely now. The hour is getting late. So I'll let you all off the hook. Thank you very much for showing up. I'll do my little 3-line prayer, and you can, if you don't know it by now, you can come along. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. Thank you very much for being here today.